In this tutorial I'm going to be looking at manual exposure settings for digital cameras and how you can use manual to really subtly capture light and capture the kind of detail you want in a photograph. So here's a few examples of my images where I'm really careful about getting the exposure just right, so I get a really nice sort of range of detail right from the highlights through to the shadow area. So it's always good to pick a point where the light is looking just right, and sometimes when a camera's on automatic settings it can compensate and it can make a guess and it can be wrong. You can miss out on lovely detail that you want to see. So I'm always keen on teaching people manual settings so that they get control of their camera. It takes a while to learn, but it's worth sticking with it because it really unlocks particularly things like landscape photography, portraiture, because suddenly you've got all this control. You can create atmospheric images, quite dark images. This picture here is one I created where I deliberately made the exposure incredibly dark. We're shooting directly into the sun, so we're making it really, really dark. You suddenly see all these strange shadows and effects of the light that your own eyesight won't pick up. I really like how careful control of manual exposure allows you to see things your eyes can't see, which is I find quite interesting. This is a snowscape from the Peak District. Things like photographing snow can be really difficult if you use an automatic setting because it's in the camera's nature to want to make everything as mid-tone as possible. So when you're photographing a very white, clean scene, like something that's full of snow and lightness, the camera's going to want to make all that lightness mid-tone, which means all that snow becomes dark. So on manual settings you can override that. You can tell the camera to be very light and you can get that kind of cleanness of snow whilst still having highlights and shadow in it, not just having it a kind of dirty grey. You can also tell the camera to make things deliberately much darker as well, so that can add a real interesting atmosphere, like this detail from a cement works. This photograph of an eclipse of the sun, a solar eclipse, I deliberately made it really dark to capture this kind of moodiness of the sky. And this lovely moment when a bird flew over, a magpie, just created a really atmospheric kind of gothic photograph. And then in caves and kind of contained spaces, sometimes if you're in a really dark space and that camera's on manual setting, it will compensate, do a really long exposure, let loads of light in, and you lose all that darkness and atmosphere. It becomes a really kind of mid-tone image and it loses those shadows and that kind of rich darkness. So manual setting allows you to control that. Looking at the screen on the back with manual settings allows you to see the atmosphere change. Every time you take a picture you see that darkness come in and you can control that. This is another one where I'm letting that darkness happen, letting the image be dark and atmospheric. And it's great for cityscapes as well. I'm not going to talk too much about night photography in this tutorial, but I'll do another tutorial about it at a later date. But understanding manual for kind of daylight exposures pays off when you're getting into night photography as well, when you're starting to deal with 10-15 second exposures. If you know how to do good manual exposure control in daylight, you can apply those same skills to nighttime. You're just working with much longer exposures. So you can capture things like this one, which I'm really proud of the Aurora Borealis, fairly near Reykjavik in Iceland. So I'm going to first of all do a quick overview of the tutorial, and then I'm going to talk you through it in detail, and then at the end I'll do the overview again, just so it's kind of bookended with the details of what you need to know about and what you need to be thinking about. So I hope this is really useful, and any questions, anywhere I can support what you're doing, just get in touch. So I've put this information panel together as an overview of the settings we need to think about. I just wanted to talk you through it to start with. I'm going to include a PDF of this with my video on YouTube, so you can download it, hopefully by me talking you through it now and showing you how it works here. That means you can download it, have it on your phone or print it off, and when you're out there trying for the first time to shoot with your camera on manual, you can refer to this sheet, and hopefully what I've spoken about now will kind of pop back into your head, so it'll be nice and helpful and a really good reminder. We're talking about having a camera on manual setting. Most cameras, to put it on manual, you switch it to the M setting. Not every camera has a manual setting, but a lot of them do. So look for the M setting, and if you put your camera on that, then you'll be in manual mode, and then you suddenly have control over how bright and dark the image is. You're not using automatic, you're making these decisions for yourself. So There are three main settings that control how bright and dark the photograph is. These are ISO, Aperture and Shutter Speed. I'm just going to look at those now and go through them and explain what each of those means, and I'm also going to show you the order I tend to set them in and how I use them to get to the right exposure. So I've ordered them here, 1, 2, 3, you can see, and that's in the order I kind of consider them when I'm setting up a photograph. So the first one I think about is the ISO, and that is where you set how sensitive the camera, the chip in the camera that collects light, that collects the image, this is where you set how sensitive that is to light. So if we've got that at 100 ISO, then it's not that sensitive to light. Your image will be quite dark. If we put that right up to 2000 ISO, then that chip is very sensitive to light, and you'll get very bright photographs. The only downside of that is the higher your ISO goes, the higher the number, the brighter the image, but also the quality of the images goes downhill. It kind of drops off. It can get kind of fuzzy, noisy, lose its quality. You're not getting the best out of the camera. If you're right down at 100, you should be getting a really good sharp image, really nice quality detail. You can usually push a camera to about 800, 1000, and it's okay in modern cameras. It'll be a bit noisy, but not too bad a problem. So that's your ISO. That's where you set how sensitive the chip is to light. I'm just going to do a quick, slightly kind of overblown demo that shows that. So if I've got it at ISO 100 here, I'm slowly going to bring it up, and you can see the whole screen brightening up, but also you can see the screen getting a bit fuzzy and a bit noisy as we get to ISO 2000. And then I go back down and you can see it darkening again. Obviously that's got nothing to do with the ISO, but it's just I wanted to do some really kind of snappy ways of explaining these, so hopefully they stick in your head, and when you're out there you'll kind of remember it a little bit more clearly. So that's your ISO. We'll set it about 200 because that's a kind of safe ISO for a nice sunny day. Now we're moving on to aperture. Now this is the second thing I usually set. The aperture is the hole in the lens that lets light through. So if we have it at f22, that hole, as you can see, is really small. That's represented by the white circle. We're calling this the lens. And then if I slowly move down, we go to f13, you can see that hole getting bigger. If I go to f8, it's getting bigger again. If I go to f5, even bigger, and f2.8, it's as big as it can go on this particular imaginary lens. So that, at the moment, is letting tons of light through. You've got an incredibly bright photograph. And then if we move all the way back to f22, that's hardly letting any light through, so you've got a much darker photograph. So that's a way of controlling the brightness and darkness of the image. Also be aware, and this is something I talk about at the end of the video that's going to follow this, that the f-stop affects the depth of field as well. So the depth of field refers to how much of the image is in focus, and the higher your f-stop, so up near f22, the smaller your aperture, but also you tend to get a really in-focused image. The area, if you focus on someone in a photograph, a lot in front of them and a lot behind them will be in focus. But if we drop right down to f2.8, then the aperture is really wide, it's letting loads of light in, but you'll find the depth of field is really minimal. It might focus on someone's eyes, but then drop off really quickly and be out of focus. So just understand that the f-stop isn't just about controlling light, it's got the payoff with the depth of field as well. And I'm just going to do another one of my crude demonstrations, which hopefully gets the idea that the f-stop brightens up the image. So I've set it to f22, and if I slowly pull that down towards f2.8, you can see this brightness coming through, this kind of flood of light that's going all over the screen. And at f2.8 we've got tons of light coming through and it's dazzling us. And then if I shut right down to f22, it's a much darker image. So that's just a little bit of a hopefully a reminder that f22 is when the aperture is small, doesn't let much light through. You want a really bright image, put it at f2. But I'm going to set that at f8 because that's a nice, safe, middling exposure. If we've got the ISO at 200 and the aperture at f8, that's probably a good setting for a fairly sunny day. So I've got those two things fixed. Now is the point where I really sort of select the exposure I want. So I usually do that on the shutter speed, and that's over here, number 3 to the right. So the shutter speed is the length of time the shutter is open to light. So we've got here ranging from 1 second to a 1,600th of a second. So you can actually hear it if you use your camera at a second, let me just do a demonstration here, that I made 2 clicks. So 1 click is the lens opening and 1 click is the lens closing. So if we do it again, and all that time when it's open, it's letting in light, and as it's letting in light, that's brightening up your image. It's making it really, really bright. Then if we go right down on the camera to 1,600 of a second and do the same thing, just 1 single click. It's just that the lens is open for a fraction of a second, like the amount of time that you could fit into a second 1,600 times. So it's just a sliver of light, which means you've got an incredibly dark exposure. You control your brightness there. So usually what I do is, when I've got my ISO set and aperture set, I then start playing around with the exposure. I might start at 2/50th, take a picture. If that's too dark, I know that I want it brighter. To make it brighter, I move nearer the 1 second mark, nearer to long exposures, maybe a 60th of a second, and take a picture. And I'm always making my decision on shutter speed by just reading the screen on the back. If I see good detail in the sky, good detail in the shadow, then I'm happy. So if I take another picture at 60th and that detail's good, that's what I shoot at. I've set up my manual exposure. Or if I'm at 2/50 of a second, I take a picture and it's much too bright, I can then do a much quicker exposure near 1,600 of a second, and suddenly you've got a really small amount of light able to hit the chip, so you get a much darker image. So that's usually what I do. I fix the ISO, I fix the aperture, and then I play with the shutter speed, reading the image on the back to get to a level of detail I really like in the image. One thing to understand is shutter speed. You may start getting lens, you may start getting motion blur. You might think you're holding your camera perfectly still, but actually you could be moving. So if you've got a relatively wide angle lens and you're getting to 60th of a second or slower, you'll probably notice that image is unsharp. So always check the sharpness if you're doing it handheld. Obviously with a tripod, then your camera's perfectly still, so you can go to a second exposure or even slower, and really it keeps it perfectly sharp and still. And just before we wrap this up, I just wanted to do a quick visual demonstration of the shutter speed, so hopefully it sort of gets that idea in your head. So this is, if we put that shutter speed down to 1 second, and then I click my camera, you saw there, you heard the click that when the lens was open, and you saw the screen go bright white. All that light from the screen would be hitting the chip. We've got an incredibly bright image. Then if we go to the other extreme, right down to 1,600 a second, and I do the same thing, let me just get that in the right setting, and then we go, you saw there that the screen went light for a fraction of a second, like the blink of an eye. Only that amount of light is hitting the lens, so you've got a very dark image. On a second, it's open for ages. You can see all that light coming in and your camera's soaking that up. So hopefully that helps you visualize it, and hopefully that helps you understand why the shutter speed affects the light. So when you're out there, you can try it with your camera. You open it for a second, you've got a second of light hitting it, you've got really bright images. So I hope that's useful, and like I say, there is going to be a PDF of this that you can download to your phone or print off, and you can take out next time you're shooting, and you can try out some of these ideas and get it working for yourself. Hello, so I'm going to do a demonstration on how to use manual settings on a camera. Not all cameras have manual settings, but a lot of SLRs and kind of compact cameras do. So I'm going to show you why that's useful, and then also I'm going to tell you how to sort of set your camera up so you have that control of exposure, because it is really useful to, if you're going to do creative photography, to be able to tell the camera to be darker or lighter. It just helps you create images that have more atmosphere, which is really important. So I'm going to give a bit of a demonstration of how to do that, and hopefully then you can try it yourself and experiment with it. So first of all, I want to show you what happens when the camera is on auto setting. So on auto, the camera makes its own decisions. It decides the exposure itself. It looks across either the whole of the image or a selected part of the image, and it makes its own decision about how bright it should be, which is really useful if you're in a place where you want the light to where you want to respond quickly to the light. Then the camera does that for you, but sometimes you want to get that creative control back. So let me demonstrate what auto does. If I point it directly at the sun, it deliberately makes the exposure really, really dark, because it's adapting for that brightness within the lens that's in the shot. But then if I bring it down to the more shadow areas, the whole thing really lights up, the exposure goes to really slow, so it jumps around, the camera's thinking for you, which again is useful, but it's not everything. Sometimes you want to control the camera yourself. So we're going to look at how to use manual settings so you can tell the camera to be lighter or darker. For example, if I pointed it at the sun here and I wanted to see detail in the tree and the wall here, I could, using manual exposure, tell it to be much lighter, let more light in, so the sun is perhaps really too bright, but you start seeing detail in other areas. So we'll look at that and I'll show you all the settings and what you need to think about to start playing around with that. So we've had a quick look there at what happens when your camera's on auto settings. You move it around, whatever's in the frame, the camera responds to that, making it lighter and darker, changing the shutter speed, aperture, and sometimes the ISO to kind of try and keep it tries to keep what's in the frame as average colour as possible, as mid-tone as possible, which is really good if you're moving through a building, moving through shadow and sunlight, because the camera's constantly changing and you're getting okay exposures. But if you want to be really creative with, say, landscape photography and really kind of get the atmosphere you want, force things to be a bit darker and more moody, force things, if you're shooting into the sun, to be brighter, you really need to get an understanding of manual control. So I'm going to show you that, and I'm going to show you what you have to think about and the different settings. So my camera is currently on manual. So there are 3 settings you can use to control how light and how dark an image is. They are the ISO, which controls how sensitive the camera is to light. They are the shutter speed, which controls how long the shutter is open. And the longer the shutter is open, the more light it lets in. The shorter it's open, so if it's open for only a fraction of a second, the less light it gets in and the more dark it is. And then you've got your aperture, which is the third way you control the exposure, and that's the hole in the lens. That's the amount of light that's let in through that hole in the lens, and you can control that through the aperture and through your f-stops. And the wider that hole is, the more light's allowed through, the brighter your images are. So between those 3 ways of controlling, the ISO, the shutter speed and the aperture, you can tell your camera to be light and dark. So the first thing I always set when I'm photographing is my ISO. I try and make sure that's fixed before I kind of zero in on the correct exposure, using a combination of the other 2, the aperture and the shutter speed. So the ISO, let me just give a quick example, is how sensitive the chip in the camera is to light. So I'm just going to take a quick picture and then I'm going to hit play on that, and it's quite dark. That was at an ISO of 100. If I now go and push that ISO up to a much higher number, we'll say 400, and I take a picture and then I hit play, you can see it's much brighter, it's a much lighter image. So the ISO, the higher it goes, the more light, the more the camera picks up light. But there is a payoff with that, because the higher it goes, also the lower quality the images are. So let me see if I can just do a demo of that. Well, you probably won't be able to see it on the screen here, but if you push your ISO right up to really high amounts, like 4,000, and take a picture, it will pick up an awful amount, a lot of light, but you'll notice the image is noisy, the detail isn't great, you get odd colours in there that aren't there in real life. It sometimes picks up blues and does weird things like that. So always try and keep your ISO down. I try and keep it down below 1,000 if I can. On a bright sunny day like this, I'll keep it down near 100, because I know I'm getting the absolute best out of the camera. You know, down near 100 you'll be getting the best quality. So once I've picked that, once I've decided on an ISO to stick with, I then start thinking about the aperture and shutter speed. So usually I try and fix one of them, and usually the one I fixed is the aperture first. So that is the hole in the lens. I'm going to do a quick demo now, cut away to a different shot where I show you the hole in the lens. So this is a demonstration of what the aperture is in your lens. This is my lens. I just hold it sideways so you can see that. And you can see there's a hole in the middle. That is the aperture, and that's the hole that lets light through. So when you're changing the aperture on your camera, you're effectively telling the camera to put this at different positions. So when it's wide open and you've got a f 2.8 or something along those lines, it's like this, and it's letting tons of light in. It's a really big hole amongst all that glass, letting lots of light hit the chip in your camera. But then if you're at f22, it's something like this, really, really small, a really, really fine hole. So when you're changing the aperture and using the different f-stops, that's what you're doing. You're controlling that hole where the light comes in, and that's why that controls the exposure quite nicely. So now I'm going to control the aperture. If I take a picture at f20, the aperture is really, really small. So if I hit play, it's very, very dark. It's actually incredibly dark and not brilliant for the demo. I'm going to put up my ISO a little bit just so we can see what happens at 20th. So if at f20, you might just be able to see a little bit of detail coming through there. If I start going to a much lower aperture, so if I start moving down to, let's say, f10 and then hit play, you're starting to see a reasonable exposure coming together. As I go down, as that number gets lower, so f10, f8, f7.1, all the time the aperture, the hole in the lens is getting bigger. So now if I take a picture at f7.1 and we hit play, you're starting to see it's getting too bright. What I usually do is fix an aperture, depending on how bright it is and depending on the depth of field, which I'm going to talk about at the end of this video. I pick an aperture which will suit my needs. So in this case, I'm going to go for about f8 because that's a nice middle aperture. I should get an okay depth of field. And you can see there, it's looking alright, but it's maybe a little bit bright. So what I've done so far is selected my ISO and I've also selected my aperture. They're two things that I'm going to keep fixed. Basically, from that point, once I've got those fixed, I then start finding my correct shutter speed. So the shutter speed is the amount of time the lens is open to light. So you can even hear it. I'm going to put my microphone really close to the camera here. This is a shutter speed of 1/10 of a second. So you hear that click, click. That's the lens being open. The lens is open for that amount of time. And then if I go for a much quicker exposure, let's push it right up to 4,000th of a second. And I'm going to put the microphone close. That is a real fraction of a second. That's such a quick exposure. The light, only a tiny sliver of light is being let through, and you can go right, most cameras let you go to exposures of 30 seconds. So on this camera, I'll just put it at a second. You can hear that, and all that light's coming in, light streaming in, the image is getting brighter and brighter. If I hit play, you can see it's absolutely, it's pure white because so much sunlight is being let in. But if I start getting to exposure times that I know will do a reasonable job here, maybe try 60th of a second, and then see that's too bright. So basically at this stage, once I've got my ISO fixed and my aperture fixed, I just start using the screen on the back to guide me to get to the correct shutter speed. So I know a 60th is too bright if I go to a quicker one. So if I go to a 200th of a second, so this is a tiny amount of time, you can see it's starting to look better. I'd say that's maybe still a tiny bit too bright. So I'm going to go to, we'll try a 400th of a second. And that's about right. That looks okay to me. I'm just as a demo, I'm going to go to even quicker amount of time. So we'll go for a 1,600th of a second. And if I take a picture of that, you'll notice now, because it's such a small sliver of time, it's getting really, really dark. So yeah, that's how the shutter speed controls the amount of light coming in. So you've got the ISO, which I try and fix at the start, which is how sensitive the camera is to light. You've got the aperture, which I fix before I do the shutter speed, and that's how big the hole is in the lens that lets light through. And then once I've fixed that, I start looking at my shutter speed and then just playing with it on the back of the screen. I never look at my meter reading or anything like that. I just literally try and read the screen and try and get good detail on the screen. So let's go back down to 400th that we know is right. And when I'm trying to pick a really nice exposure, I'm looking for good detail in the sky. So we can see that nice little bit of blue up here, which is coming through quite nicely. You can see a bit of detail in the shadows. You're looking for an exposure that does an overall job that's quite right, that's quite good. And let me show you when this really comes in useful. So I'm going to take my camera off the tripod. You remember when we showed you the auto settings on the camera and pointed it directly at the sun? So let me just take a picture. If we do that now, because my camera is on fully manual, it's incredibly bright. but I've suddenly got control over what it can do. If I want it to be dark, I can change my exposure to 3,200 of a second and take a picture, and suddenly we've got that really silhouetted trees. But then I can also, because I've got on manual settings, I'm overriding what the camera wants. So we can make it very bright, 800 of a second, and suddenly we're pointing at the sun, but we're starting to see detail in the foreground. So let me get the wall in it. So starting to see a little bit of detail. Ooh. And then let's go even brighter still. So we're pointing at the sun. Oh, I think we should go even brighter still. So we're pointing at the sun and you've got all that detail in the wall. It's not a brilliant photograph, but you can see by having manual settings, suddenly we've got all this lovely control over the exposure. So say you're photographing into a sunset, sometimes everything wants to be really silhouetted when it's an auto setting, but with manual setting you can make it brighter than the camera wants to be, and suddenly the whole landscape glows. Or equally, if you're indoors shooting out, sometimes the auto setting wants to make everything really, really bright, but with manual settings you can force it to be darker. So you've got all this control, and that's the point when you can suddenly start being creative with your photography and using your exposure in a really nice way. Okay, so I just want to do one last quick demonstration of a final thing that you need to think about, which is your white balance. So this is how the camera, oh, let's have a look. This is how the camera picks up light. If you're outdoors, the light is very, very different in the middle of the day to say you're indoors and under tungsten light or fluorescent lights. Tungsten light can be really warm, fluorescent lights can be kind of green and odd looking. So your camera has white balance settings, and you can flick through them. So if I slowly flick through the white balance settings, you can see that image on the top here. Oh, let me hold it. Is always changing to do the different settings. So oh, I totally did the wrong thing there. So you can see if it goes to fluorescent setting or tungsten setting, it's very cold. So you need to find the right white balance for the image. There's a sunny day setting which does a good job here. I now shoot a lot of my photography as RAW, which means you can choose your white balance when you're sat at your computer later. So I often shoot with it on auto because I know that when I'm back at my computer I can find my own white balance that really does the job nicely. But sometimes if you're shooting JPEGs and your camera, you're making your decisions about the white balance in camera, then it's really good to get that correct for the situation you're in. So having an understanding of white balance is important. You might make that decision further down the line when you're in your studio sat at your computer, but it's good to know what those settings are. So I'm just going to talk about one more thing that I mentioned briefly earlier. That's how the aperture, which is a hole in the lens that lets the light through, also affects something that's known as your depth of field. So the depth of field is how much of an image is in focus. You focus the camera on one point, and if it's got a very low depth of field, if you're in front of that point or behind that point, the focus will fall off really, really quickly. But if you've got a very high depth of field, so we're calling a low depth of field maybe 2.8, that means the aperture is very wide open, it's letting lots of light in, but that depth of focus isn't very wide. But if you go for if you want a lot of the image in focus and you shoot at a really narrow aperture of say f/22, then you get a huge expanse of the image, nice and sharp and in focus. So right from the front of the image to the back can be in focus depending on the lens you're using and things like that. So it's good to know that the aperture, as well as controlling the exposure, letting more light in or less light in depending on the size of that hole, also controls the thing called the depth of field. And sometimes having a very low depth of field can be a pain. If you're in a room and everything's moving and you miss your focus slightly, then the shot's soft and it doesn't look great. But sometimes having a really low depth of field with portraiture is really good. It can be really nice. You can have that thing where it's really sharp on the eyes and then immediately it falls out of focus if you use quite a long lens. So it's another way of being creative. Sometimes you just want to be safe and have a really large depth of field. Sometimes deliberately keeping it narrow can create really atmospheric images that have a really nice kind of feel to them. So I'm going to show you 5 images now that demonstrate how the depth of field changes, and I'll just explain them as they go along. So here's a set of 5 exposures at different f-stops, so you can see how the depth of field is affected. The first exposure is going to be 2.5, and that's when the aperture is really wide, so you have a very low depth of field. And you notice there, only the bucket that I focused on is in focus. The shed and the branch in front is really soft. I'm now going to go to f5 and take another picture, and you'll notice things are getting a tiny bit sharper. It happens quite slowly, that extra detail coming in. But if I push it up, right up to the highest this lens will go, f22, and take a picture, and then we have a look at that, you'll notice suddenly that shed in the background is really detailed. The other thing hanging from the tree has a lot of detail. Suddenly there's a lot more sharpness there. So that's how the depth of field is affected by the aperture of your lens. So the aperture controls the amount of light coming in. If it's very wide, it lets a lot of light in. If it's very small, it lets hardly any light in. But it also controls that depth of field. If it's very small and not letting much light in, then also you're going to get a lot of the photograph in focus from front to back. I just wanted to do a very final recap of the manual settings. We've been through it a few times now, but it's always good to do a quick reminder at the end. So if your camera is on M for manual, then you suddenly have control of 3 things: your ISO, aperture and shutter speed. The ISO is how sensitive the camera is to light. So if that's at 100 ISO, it's not that sensitive to light. If it's 2000, it's very sensitive, but the quality of the image drops. So that's what the ISO means. And then the aperture is the hole in the lens. Is that's up at f22, it's a very small hole, it's hardly letting any light through. If we bring that right to 2.8, it's a big hole letting tons of light through, so a much brighter image. At f22, it's a much darker image. That's your aperture. Don't forget about how that also controls your depth of field. We talked about that and saw that in the video. Once you've got those 2 things set, you've got your shutter speed, which is the length of time the lens is open and the camera is soaking up light. At a second, you get all that light flowing in, a really bright image. At 1,600 a second, you get a slight snap of light, hardly any, and it's a really dark image. And then obviously you've got all the points in the middle where somewhere within there your exposure will sit. Or outside, sometimes if it's a night shot, you might end up going right down to 10 seconds, 30 seconds to really soak up the little light that's there. Or if you're shooting into the sun, you might go right up to 3,200 per second to really create a dark shot. So this is just a demo. Cameras can go further than these often. So I hope that's really useful, and like I say, there's a PDF download of this on my YouTube channel which you can save to your phone or print out, so you can have this information with you while you're out there shooting. So I hope this back garden photo demonstration has been useful. I'm in isolation at the moment, so I'm going to try and use this time to do more of these demonstrations. I've got an idea of showing a bit about night photography at some point, and also a bit about how to use Photoshop to create an invisible person. So I'll be sharing those on Twitter and social media, so keep your eyes open. One really important thing to always keep in mind when doing photography is, these are technical things I'm talking about, but composition, ideas. There's so much creative stuff you have to remember when you're doing photography as well. It's not just about the technique and making the camera work properly. It's about being creative, and the more you learn these skills, the more you learn to control your camera, the more kind of intuitive you get, and the more you're able to be quite playful or just be creative with your photography and create the images that suit you, that you want to create. So I hope this has been useful, and I'll try and share more, and thanks for watching.